Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit.
Okay, all you citizens of the world, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of September 21st. And recently I had the pleasure of going to a party in the backyard of our next guest, the one and only Flint Taylor, the author of the great book, The Torture Machine, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago, is someone who I always like to get on the show to fill me in on what's really going on. And recently I heard on the radio some real talk about wrongful conviction cases here in Chicago and Illinois. Flint, can you give us a little insight into what kind of wrongful conviction cases we're talking about?
Well, we're talking about a gamut of cases, but the focus or a focus is wrongful convictions based on coerced confessions. And of course, when you talk about that, you have to bring up the name of John Burge, and you have to bring up the police torture cases that happened in this city for over 20 years back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. So many of these wrongful conviction cases are men and a few women as well, who were tortured by Burge and ended up spending decades, first in some on death row, and then later commuted to life sentences, long sentences. But many of them have become exonerated by the courts or pardoned by the governor. And when that happens, they can bring lawsuits. So what's happened is these folks that have been exonerated after spending decades in the penitentiary, a good portion of them based on tortured confessions by Burge, they are able to bring lawsuits. And these lawsuits have historically been defended by pinstripe lawyers. Pinstripe patronage is what Gene Pitcham used to call them. They're lawyers, private lawyers that are hired by the city to do the city's dirty work, and they're paid hourly rates, and they're predominantly white. They're predominantly former prosecutors, and they're predominantly from firms that are in the game to bill as much as they can to fight these cases, even though there's no real basis in law or in fact to fight them. So those are the cases, and what you've heard in the media is a lot of those cases have come home to roost. And what I mean by that is the exonerated men and women have brought these lawsuits, and the city with these lawyers continue to fight them. And sometimes in the case that just made publicity because it was a $50 million verdict to a young man who was, it's not a Burge case, but it was a false confession case, and he was interrogated on video. And despite it being on video, the jury was so outraged that it gave this young man $50 million for 10 years in the penitentiary. And what we learned was that these lawyers that I'm talking about would not offer beyond $3 million in a settlement. I don't know, but I assume that the lawyers for this man probably would have settled for somewhere in the area of 10 million, which would have been $1 million per year, which is what a lot of juries give, and some settlements end up as. But the city wouldn't give over 3. So what the city ended up was a $47 million bath from the number they offered, a $40 million bath from what the lawyers probably would have taken, plus paying these pinstripe lawyers another $3-4 million to try the case. So this is what the city of Chicago and its law department is dealing with right now. And they haven't been dealing with it in any way different than the mayors, starting with Richie Daley and then Rahm and Lori Lightfoot, have dealt with it.
Is there a grand total of what the city is out over the last few years on wrongful conviction and torture cases?
There is, and I know numbers sometimes they can boggle the mind, or they just make your eyes glaze. But then I've been tracking the numbers that have been paid to these lawyers, these pinstripe lawyers, to fight cases, many of which I've been involved in for the plaintiffs, for the Burge torture survivors. And there's also been a tracking of the broader wrongful conviction cases, Burge and others. And so in the last 20 years or 25 years, the Burge cases have cost the city and the county and the state collectively about $260 million. That's $260 million, of which
that would cover a lot of issues around the city.
you bet. And the city has paid the vast majority of that amount of money, around $220 million of that Burge money. When you go more broadly to the wrongful conviction cases and you look at how much money has been paid out, it becomes $750 million. That's $750 million over the last 25 years. And of that, $150 million of that has gone to the pinstripe lawyers. So when Mayor Johnson was elected, and when he was running for mayor, he said, we're going to change this kind of thing. We're going to deal with reparations. We're going to deal with these wrongful conviction cases. We realize that Burge was a serial torturer, and we're not going to defend these cases anymore. But now we've had an 18-month sample of the administration and its corporation counsel. And that is a woman by the name of Mary Richardson Lowry. And her history goes back to Richie Daley's administration. So she has taken over, and it's been business as usual. We're seeing these same predominantly white pinstripe lawyers in these cases. They're raising the same kind of frivolous issues. They're fighting these cases. They're not stepping to the plate to settle these cases. And just generally, you have to ask, after 18 months, what is different about what Mayor Johnson is doing with regard to torture and wrongful convictions than what the previous mayors have been doing? You have the same approaches, and you have, let me give you a couple of examples, if I might, Michael, of what these lawyers are doing. In one case that's still pending, or two cases that are pending torture cases, the judge that was assigned to the case is a newly minted African-American judge, a wonderful civil rights lawyer by the name of Jeff Cummings, impeccable reputation. Two of these torture cases were sent to this African-American judge, the first African-American federal judge to ever sit on torture cases and all the history of all the torture cases. So what does the city do? These white lawyers, with the approval of Mary Richardson Lowry, the corp counsel, they try to recuse this judge. And they make arguments about how, as a civil rights lawyer, he signed a report that spoke to the issues of police torture. So they said, well, he's got to be recused. Well, he very thoughtfully denied that request. So Lowry and her gang of pinstripers took it to the Federal Court of Appeals here in Chicago. And it took the Federal Court of Appeals 2 days to throw out that appeal. But that's the kind of money that's being thrown at the defense of Burge cases. And another one I'll give you, and as you know, Michael, and your listeners may as well, the Jackie Wilson case. I am one of the lawyers in Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson, along with his brother Andrew, is the seminal case of police torture that exposed the electric shock and all of that in police cases. And Jackie, after 36 years, was finally released. We were able to get him a certificate of innocence, and we went to federal court. And the county stepped up for its role in the case because the prosecutors in the case had been committing perjury and covering up evidence and been involved in the tortured confession and all of that. So they offered, and we accepted $17 million for the county's role. Well, the city has not followed suit for their role, which of course Burge's role was even more significant. And instead, they have been fighting the case, and they've done some remarkable things that even under the prior administration haven't been done. And that is many of the detectives, including Burge, have taken over the years the Fifth Amendment. Their lawyers have advised them, don't come in and lie and commit perjury because you might end up like Burge did in the federal joint for your perjury. So in this case, in the Jackie Wilson case, despite the fact that the state court judge found that these detectives had tortured Jackie, found it as a judicial finding, these lawyers came in and got one of the main torturers who, along with Burge, who's now dead, had previously taken the Fifth Amendment and had him, what they say, come off the Fifth Amendment and come in and say, oh, I never committed the perjury. So now Mayor Johnson's lawyers are standing behind a Burge detective who is now, we think, and certainly the judge in the state court thought, had committed torture and has come in and under oath said, I didn't torture anybody. That's what's happening behind the Johnson administration and their pinstripe lawyers and the kind of lengths they're going to deny the torture that Johnson has recognized publicly has happened.
Flint, let me ask you, has the Corporation Council, the pinstripe lawyers, have they had any successes? I mean, it sounds like, and then why are they so resistant? I mean, is it built into the Corporation Council job? I did hear one thing recently that the Mayor Johnson, was better on the right to protest at the Democratic Convention than his Corporation Council wanted him to be, or they were the more conservative force around all that issue. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm just wondering who are these people and why do they have the power to try and belittle our judicial system after it comes up with what we consider to be pretty just decisions?
Well, you ask about Johnson versus the Corporation Council, and you have to wonder whether they built some kind of wall between Johnson and the lawyers, and that whether Johnson is vetting any of these decisions, because he seems like the type of person that if he goes out and says, these people who have been wrongfully convicted, these people who have been tortured need to be compensated. We need to deal with these cases up front. You would think that the lawyers would follow suit, but the opposite is the case. As I've said, things have not only stayed the same, they've gotten worse in some instances. These lawyers, as I said, many of them are former state's attorneys, former prosecutors who believed in Burge, who believed in getting confessions no matter how you got them. Some of them were involved in actually presenting these confessions in court in their prior careers as state's attorneys. They, by and large, are of two kinds. As I said, they're predominantly, if not exclusively, white lawyers. They have their own firms, sometimes from big firms. They have a background in law enforcement, and they're either true believers, they line up with the FOP in ideology, in what they believe and how they deny, they're deniers, or they're lawyers who are in it for the money. and the money's good. Some of these lawyers have gone from having a little tiny firm to starting their own firm. Some of these lawyers have made 30, 40 million dollars. Some of these firms the total being 150 million. There's 4 or 5 firms that have made the vast majority of that money. So the money's good. The lawyers are making a lot of money, and they're and the track record in terms of raising these issues. They know how to raise these issues and to avoid admitting that the city had a policy as implemented by Burge of torturing people. And so they do in court. I try to sidestep what their leaders, from Rahm with reparations to Laurie when Burge died to Mayor Johnson when he ran for office, said and admitted about torture. And then they go in court and try to avoid those very, very definitive statements by the head of the government. They don't have any success ultimately, Mike.
But they make money. They make money in slowing it down.
They make money, exactly, and they take it all the way to the eve of trial, and then they offer a settlement. So they've made money, and so that money goes to the lawyers rather than to victims of torture or wrongful conviction.
Well, it sounds to me like that maybe the Corporation Council is separate from. It's like Trump trying to control the Justice Department, where the Justice Department wants to be independent, but it happens to be loaded with bad guys.
Right.
Anyhow, let's switch a little bit and talk about the police in general. Chicago has a long history, not only in the assassination of the beloved Fred Hampton, but we certainly have situation with Laquan McDonald being shot, the Burge torture cases. And there's a whole lot of other things which you know about and many of our listeners know about. And I'm wondering, has there been any improvement in the Chicago police? I mean, we always know there were good cops, not so good cops, some real bad cops. The city has this new Empowering Communities for Public Safety Act, where we have police district councils, which are supposed to, they're charged with building connections between the police and the community, collaborate on the implementation of community policing, et cetera. I'm wondering if that's had any impact yet on the police. Or is it the same old story where the police tend to not only serve and protect, but beat this out of people whenever they can?
Well, I think the latter is the case, Michael. Probably the statistics are that they don't shoot and kill as many Black people as they did 50 years ago, but they still do it, and they still do it in outrageous ways. We know about the Dexter Reed case that happened back, I think in the spring, where tactical unit officers hopped out, the jump out units. They still have those units, and got into a thing with Dexter Reed and put 96 bullets into his car and ultimately shot him while he was unarmed behind his car, supposedly because he didn't have on a seatbelt, which was obviously just a pretext for them stopping a Black man in a new car in the Black community. And so that's a kind of another case in a long line of cases like you have mentioned, but there are others that go along with that. And it all flows from the same principle, which is the police aren't there to serve and protect. They are there really, if we get right down to the bare bones of it, to suppress in those communities, in the poor and Black and brown communities. That's the way they operate, and they haven't changed in their operations in that sense, whether it be a tactical unit, whether it be stop and frisk, shaking down people. There have been incremental changes. There was a consent decree, and we see each 6 months, well, they're in 3% compliance. I think the latest number is they're in 7% compliance. Now, this consent decree was entered when? Back when Trump was president. It was entered just as Trump became president. So we're talking about 7 or 8 years ago, and they're 7% in compliance. And another misstep in my point of view, from my viewpoint, when Johnson became mayor, is who he appointed as his superintendent. We saw one of the things that was a huge mistake by Harold Washington was to appoint Leroy Martin as his police superintendent. And of course, Martin was a former boss of Burge, and the rest is history, of course. Now we have Johnson appointing from within Snelling. And what was Snelling? Snelling back in the 90s was involved in one of these tactical units. He had something like 8 or 10 brutality complaints against him back in the 90s. How can you appoint someone like that to be the mayor? I mean, to be the police superintendent. So it's got to start from the top. And I haven't seen anything that's told me that Snelling is taking an aggressive approach to police violence. And so I have to be rather pessimistic. I mean, after George Floyd was murdered, there was a real move in city council and across the country to, if not defund the police, to certainly cut back the monies that went to police and cut back on the kinds of things that they were doing. One of the major problems is mental health issues, and the police kill and maim and beat a lot of people who are suffering from some form of mental health crisis. They shouldn't be involved in that situation, but they are, and that's why we see all of these cases that we see. That case down in Springfield, I don't know if people are aware of the Massey case, how outrageous that was. Well, that woman might not have been acting exactly how the police expected her to act. She might have been having some mental issues, but they just basically shot her in cold blood. And it was so outrageous that the prosecutor down there indicted the cops for murder. And that's almost unheard of, to indict a cop for murder. You might get him for manslaughter. You might get him for, negligent homicide. But anyway, to answer your question, I think that to some degree, more things change, the more they stay the same.
Well, Flint, we're going to run out of time, but we got a few minutes left. And then one of the things I teach people with at the beginning was that one of the reasons we wanted you to come on, because you had told me you have a new book in the works. Your last book, The Torture Machine, is pretty wonderful. And for those people who really want to know the nitty gritty of some history that's gone on in this town, they should check it out. But one of the people who you and I have known a lot about, Ed Hanrahan, he was a state's attorney. He was involved with COINTEL program and Hoover in the FBI. And they assassinated Fred Hampton, who was, I could say he was our leader at that time in a lot of ways. Can you give us a little bit? I think we have 3 or 4 minutes, and about the book, how you're doing on it, when we might expect it, and what's it all about? 3 minutes.
3-minute drill. Well, back when the pandemic happened, and I would go to my office kind of as a lone ranger, so to speak.
Oh, that feeling.
I started to go down in the basement of our office where our archives with regard to all of the Fred Hampton case that we litigated for so many years are kept. And so my first approach was to digitalize a lot of the transcripts and documents and by scanning them in. So I started to do that, and I started to look at what I was scanning in, the Hanrahan testimony, the Groth testimony, who led the raid, et cetera, et cetera. And it occurred to me that as much as my partner, Jeff Haas, who had written The Assassination of Fred Hampton, had written, and all of the articles I had written about the Hampton case and all the speaking we've done, that we primarily focused, and rightfully so, on the FBI's role in the conspiracy, the COINTELPRO, the O'Neill setting up the raid, all of that. And Hanrahan, who was the state's attorney and who with his first assistant Jolovec, actually planned the raid with the assistance of the FBI, that it was mentioned, it was written about to some limited degree, but it hadn't been focused on. So I thought it's time that history looks at prosecutors and particularly Hanrahan and his people's role in the Hampton case, starting at the very beginning of the planning of the raid and going all the way through until he was dethroned several years later. So the book is called Prosecutors, Politicians, Police Violence, A Chicago Story. And it documents not only Hanrahan and the Hampton case, but then it moves into the torture cases and specifically Jackie Wilson's 40-year history in terms of his case and all the different things the prosecutors did in that case. So it's about prosecutors, it's about Daley and the politicians, and it's again about police violence, focusing on the assassination of Fred Hampton and the torture of the Wilson brothers.
Flint Taylor, People's Lawyer. When might this book be coming out? And I think it's going to be Haymarket, right?
It's Haymarket, as was the first. And, you know, we're getting to the final stages of editing. I'm hoping that it'll come out early next year.
Maybe be a race, you and me and Katie, on who gets the Heartland book or your book. It's great hearing you talk. I just wanted to let people know that Hanrahan was probably the next in line to be the mayor after Mayor Daley until this all happened and we turned it around. Flint, you do great work. I think you'll continue to do that for a while because I know you're out there running, keeping yourself in good shape.